All right, thanks again, everybody, for coming to Pixels and Pieces. This is one of our speaker days. So today with us, joining us is Jamey Stegmaier. He is co-founder of Stegmaier Games, designer of a number of board games, including Viticulture and Scythe, and he has authored the book, a crowdfunder's strategy guide. Build a better business by building community. Thanks for joining us, Jamey.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
All right,
David, this is a smaller group. Could you have everyone say their names?
I guess I'm Sam. Is that?
Hi, Sam.
I'm Marissa.
Marissa, hi.
I'm Bree.
Hi, Bree.
I'm John.
John.
I'm Sarah. And Rachel.
Awesome. Thank you.
and I'm Jeremy, in case anyone doesn't know me.
Well, I'm Jamey. I mean, that's what I'm doing here. And I guess Jeremy said that we're going to be talking a little bit about Kickstarter and mostly Kickstarter and crowdfunding today. Are most of you, raise your hand, I guess. I'll do show of hands because I can hear you kind of, but not all that well. How many of you are interested in running a Kickstarter campaign at some point? But you're curious about it?
In my life at some point, I guess. Yeah.
Marissa, you didn't raise your hand. Are you more interested in just designing games?
No, I'm interested in like checking out the meeting, and I'm gonna write a paper about it for journalism.
Okay. And how many of you are game designers? Is that?
Oh, sure. Technically, on that. Yeah.
I do the art.
Okay, awesome. Awesome. Jeremy, you sent me some great questions in advance. You just want me to go through them organically?
Yeah, sure. So just to start off, obviously, since none of us have kickstarted anything, I think it's a little. It appears a little unsurmountable to some. So I was wondering what it takes to begin preparing for a Kickstarter.
Yeah, I like that question. For this question, I'm going to throw it back at you guys because there are a few things that you can do well in advance of running the Kickstarter, and I'm kind of curious where you all are right now with that. The first thing is, how many of you have backed at least 10 Kickstarter campaigns or crowdfunding campaigns?
Gotta count.
I know it would be close to 10. I don't know, but
Okay.
like tiny ones. I don't know if they really should count.
So that's like the number one thing that I recommend you do, because you can learn so much by following a campaign, following the project updates, commenting in the community. You can learn what appeals to you, what doesn't appeal to you. And it's almost like paying attention to your emotional reaction of someone else's campaign. Like if you missed out on an early bird, how that makes you feel and how that might impact whether or not you're going to put an early bird reward in your campaign, that type of thing.
Yeah.
One of the other things, I have a cheat sheet here too of my notes. How many of you are active in on Board Game Geek? How many of you have commented this week on Board Game Geek, or any community that you are, any online community that's related to a project you might want to run? I mentioned Board Game Geek because it's mostly board game related. So that, I think, is a huge thing, like being involved in the community of the category of your project, whether it's board games or something completely unrelated to board games.
Yeah.
How many of you have? How many of you create some sort of content that people can tap into, whether it's a blog or a podcast, a YouTube channel, an e-newsletter? How many of you have anything like that?
I don't think.
I just do it because I work here. So.
That's another huge thing, I think, to learn how to not just go out to another community that already exists, but also learn how to host your own community, because that's essentially what a Kickstarter project is. It's you're running a community based around that project for 30 or so days. And also, by starting to build that community in advance, you avoid one of the biggest mistakes that a creator can make, which is not going into the campaign having already established a crowd, or at least some people who are aware of what you're doing and are a fan of what you're doing. One of you, I think, one of you mentioned that you're an artist. So do you share your portfolio online?
Oh, but not much.
Not much. Yeah. I think that's one of the great ways that if you do share that online, then people who are fans of it can start to follow it. And if you ever put out like an art book, or if your art is ever featured in a game or some other project, they're already connected to it. I would say those are the big three that you can start to do now, well in advance of running a project. Did any of you have any questions about this?
Makes sense.
Actually, I do.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
So you're starting a blog, YouTube, podcast or something, what would be the content that you would start posting now? Because like I'm still working on designing the game, so it's not like I'm being 100% concrete. It's like what sort of things would I be talking about?
That's a great question. And I think it's okay. So like, I think the toughest thing about starting a blog or a podcast or a YouTube channel is the actual starting of it, like posting the first entry, even if it ends up being quite different than what the blog evolves into. So the way I approach it is, so I have two blogs. I have a personal blog and I have a company blog. And my personal blog is the one where I kind of learned about it. And at the beginning, I just wrote about whatever I was excited about that day. And the more I wrote, the more that evolved into more specific content. But at the beginning, it was just whatever excited me that day. And I think that's okay, because you don't want to pigeonhole yourself from the beginning into a topic that by like the second month, you don't care that much about anymore. I think it's the act of writing and the act of figuring out how to write something or create something that other people are going to engage in. That's the important part, creating that engagement. Does that help answer your question?
Thank you.
Okay.
So in getting people to engage with you in that way, what would you say is the best method to get industry people and the gaming community leaders to get behind your project?
Yeah. So one of the big things, and this is kind of vague, but also really important, is to design something that doesn't already exist. Go after something unique rather than a variation of something that's already out there. Because that's what people get excited about. I think a lot of like the board game reviewers that I follow, they see a lot of the same thing day after day. And that's okay. And they still review it, they still talk about it. But the things that they get really excited about and the things that people want to talk about are the things that are unique. That's part of it. I think the second part is to start to engage existing content creators when you don't need them to do anything for you. So basically, like, don't make your first contact with someone, don't make it an ask. Don't be asking them to do something for you the first time you reach out to them. That happens a fair amount to me, because I write this Kickstarter blog and I'll have Kickstarter creators reach out to me and ask me to promote their project or write about their project. And sometimes they do that in a way that's appealing to me. And that the way they do that is they say, hey, I got this project. I've done this unique thing that I think your readers might be interested in. You want to talk about that on your blog? And that's cool. But the ones that reach out to me and ask me to promote their work, and I've never heard of them before, they've never commented on my blog or engaged with me in any way, it's really off-putting. And I think a lot of content creators experience that. So I think it's key to start to build those relationships, even if it's just commenting on a blog or someone's YouTube video or their guild on Board Game Geek, just so they recognize your name and realize that you're not there, that you've been there for a while, that you're not just showing up at the moment that you need something from them. Yeah, those are the big three that I wrote down for this one, Jeremy.
Awesome. So Kickstarter is one of a number of crowdsourcing methods that we have available to us. And there's other ways to get a game out in the market. How would you know if Kickstarter is the right place to release a project? Or would it be better to sell a game to a large gaming company if that's possible?
Yeah, so I think this boils down to one key question. And I'll say it, and I'll ask you guys after I say it, after you know what I'm asking you. I think if you want to be a game designer and just design games, then running a Kickstarter probably isn't what you want to do. In that case, that's a choice that you'll make to submit games to publishers. The other option is if you were interested in running a business, a company, which is essentially what a Kickstarter project becomes. You are creating a company around a product, and you're doing everything. You're doing the marketing, you're doing the logistics, you're coordinating all the artists and graphic designers. You're doing every aspect of the business. So if you want to run a business and being an entrepreneur appeals to you, then I think a Kickstarter can be really exciting. So I'll turn that around on you all. How many of those of you who are game designers, how many of you just like being a game designer?
Kind of just like marketing's scary, I guess.
And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I think it's just figuring out if that's what you are, what you want to be. And I guess the other side is how many of you have that entrepreneurial spirit? How many of you want to run a business? Jeremy? Okay.
Yes.
There's no wrong answer either way, but I just think that's an important question to ask yourself as you move forward.
Okay. Well, if we choose to run a Kickstarter, I know there's a lot of different aspects of Kickstarter that's a little ambiguous, a lot of different choices that you can make while running your Kickstarter. I think the very first one that I think comes to some people's minds is they give you a pretty wide range on how long you can make your Kickstarter last.
Yeah.
How long should we shoot for? What is an optimum range that you think works for this kind of thing?
Yeah. So I've run, what have I run? I've run 8 projects on Kickstarter so far. And the longest was 42 days. And the shortest, I believe, was 16 days. So about 2 weeks. And what I found through running those projects and by looking at a ton of data that a friend of mine collected about Kickstarter projects is that the first project should be between 30 and 35 days, which it's a key amount of time. It's long enough for you to kind of figure out how things work, because you'll probably stumble through a little bit of the process, but it's not so long that it takes away all urgency. Because if you have a really long project, it doesn't necessarily equal more funding, because if there's less urgency, then people might just wait and wait and wait and may never back it. For your second project, if you get to that point where running a second project, the optimal timeline decreases a little bit to about 25 to 30 days. And then for someone like me, I've run 8 projects. Now I try to keep it between 15 and 25 days at the very most. Even my last project, Scythe, was 24 days, and it was a lot of fun, but it also felt like an eternity. It felt very long because it's a full-time job while you're running a campaign. It's a lot of work.
Right.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I think that the next thing people think of when they're wanting to run a Kickstarter is there's so many different pledge levels you can create. When thinking about your product, how would you come up with your optimum costs per pledge and different funding levels?
Yeah, this is where the budget becomes a huge part of the equation, and it's so important to budget properly before you run a Kickstarter project. And so there are a few parts of this equation. The overarching idea is what the funding goal should be and how much it should be. And that really just ties directly to the budget, and it's related to the minimum print run that you're limited to. For most board games, the minimum print run is 1,000 copies, and most manufacturers prefer it to be 1,500 copies. For a smaller cards-only game, you can probably get it down to 500 copies or even lower for some smaller specialized manufacturers. But basically what I do when I make a campaign, I figure out I already know that minimum quantity, and I figure out the price per unit to make a game at that quantity, and then I add on shipping on top of that, and that's my funding goal. That's the minimum amount I need to make the game. In terms of how to price the reward levels themselves, part of it has to do with just looking at other projects and other games and seeing what their prices are. If your game has similar components to those games, usually it's a pretty close match to the components, at least in terms of perception. Like people see a game like Carcassonne, and that's their perception of a game with like a tile placement game. And if your game has a lot of tiles that's similar to that and a few meeples, then they're going to be looking for a price point similar to Carcassonne. But the formula that many publishers use and that I use is 5 times manufacturing cost. So if I have a game that costs about $10 to make, the MSRP will be $50, and then I'll usually discount it on Kickstarter down to usually about a 20-25% discount. So I would price a $50 game at $39 on Kickstarter. And part of that psychological, having that 9 on the end of the number has a huge psychological impact on people's willingness to consider it a good deal or good value. So those are usually when I'm pricing it out, that's what I'm considering. I'm looking at the cost per unit and how that relates to the overall goal, and each individual game, how much that relates to the MSRP for that game.
Awesome. Okay, and then the third thing that I think is a lot of people have trouble with when they're thinking about kickstarting a project is the idea of stretch goals. I think it's important, especially with the board game industry. But stretch goals seem to be evolving right now.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a plan that you think works well for stretch goals, and where do you see that working when you begin a Kickstarter?
Yeah, I think you're right that it's a system that's always in flux and it's evolving, but I think there are a few constants to consider. So what I do when I'm planning out a project is, again, it comes back to the budget. I usually try to figure out what the core game is, the game that I want to present on day one of the project. And it has to be a complete game. It has to be fun and functional. And it has to have at least one, usually one component that will get people really excited about it. So like if I have, in Euphoria, for example, I had these nice custom dice. And I'm not even sure looking back now, it's been a while. But I sure hope that those custom dice were part of the product from day one. Because you don't want to necessarily make everything a carrot on a stick for people to stretch for. Something's got to excite them from day one. So when I figure out what that is, and I build the stretch goals from there, all through the budget. So I'll talk with my manufacturer and figure out, okay, what are the things that we can do to either make the game nicer in terms of component quality, or to add more items to the game while only adding incremental costs. Because one of the biggest, the dangerous things with stretch goals is that you add something in that inflates your budget to the point that you are going to lose money. And there's no reason to lose money on a big sort of project. This almost happened to me on Viticulture, which was the first board game project I ran, where I was, I talked with my manufacturer in advance, and I had a good idea of the stretch goals. And then I was having a great time with the backers during the project, discussing the stretch goals and getting their ideas, which was a lot of fun. It's fun to talk to the backers about that. And I was throwing a lot of those ideas back at my manufacturer to see if we could do them. And one of the ideas that came up was to add metal coins to the game. Metal coins are something that I've done in several games up until this point, at this point, but they're always an additional cost. It's a premium reward, not a stretch goal, because they're quite expensive. But at the time, I was so excited about it that I just added them as a stretch goal. And I'm very lucky that we didn't reach that stretch goal, because I wouldn't have a company now. So it was one of those things where I let my enthusiasm get a hold of me. And I've seen other creators do that too, where they get so excited about something awesome like metal coins that they forget the budget, and it really all comes back to the budget in the end, no matter how excited people are about it.
Yeah.
We talked a lot about all this knowledge you have to have going into the Kickstarter and knowing exactly what it's going to cost or approximately what it's going to cost, and having spoken with your manufacturer beforehand and that sort of thing. But I know there's a lot of front-end costs when it comes to making games, like artwork and that sort of stuff.
Right.
What is it? How ready for release does your game need to be before you put it on Kickstarter?
Yeah. So my approach is that I like to have the game between 95 and 99% done, and by that I mean that it's not just an idea. It's a designed and developed and play tested and blind play tested game that I am confident with as it is. And I say 99%. I didn't say 100% because I do like to leave just like a tiny little bit of design space open for backer engagement, because oftentimes backers will want to play the game during the campaign, and they might have an idea for a card or an idea for a small thing. And sometimes that's okay to have that wiggle room in that space. And it can be a lot of fun to work with the backers to add that type of thing. So that's the game itself, or whatever the product is. But and you mentioned art, Jeremy, which I think is another key part of this. And you have an artist in the room, so I think this is relevant. I think the more art that you can have done for the project, the better. And so, like for my projects, I do try to have a lot of the art done before the campaign. But oftentimes creators, a big part of the reason they're raising money on Kickstarter is so they can afford the art in the first place, which is completely valid. And so in those cases, I suggest to creators that you get like 3 to 5 pieces of the art, of final art, ready that you can display on the project page. Usually the box, the game box, and a few other images. Like if you have characters in the game, have 1 or 2 characters. If you have other event cards, have 1 or 2 event cards. Have like 1 or 2 pieces of art per component in the game. So you can show people, so you can kind of invite people into the world of the game or of your product to see if they are, if they think that the art is a good fit. It's basically just giving them a sample so they can make an informed decision.
Awesome. So when it comes to game design, and this might step slightly away from Kickstarter, or it might not. Are there any industry-specific tricks or methods for advertising that are different from other industries, and how does that work?
Well, I think the common thread for any industry is to figure out who your target audience is, and then go find that audience. Go find where that audience hangs out, online or in person, and become a part of that community. In terms of strictly advertising, and strictly with the board game community, I have had great success using ads on Board Game Geek itself, because it's unlike many other industries, it is a fairly concentrated place where many gamers congregate to talk about board games. So we're kind of lucky in the board game industry to have a single place like that. So I've had a great return on my investment of the ads that I put on there. Yeah.
And then what should we expect when it comes to promoting our game?
Yeah, so promoting is a word that I'm glad you used that word. It's something that I try to avoid at all costs, basically. When I have a campaign on Kickstarter, I'm not talking about it on Facebook every day. I'm not talking about it on Twitter every day. I'm not emailing people and asking them to promote my game for me. Because I think it gets, I'm sure you all have had that experience on some form of social media, and it gets annoying pretty quickly, right? Like the first few times maybe you see it, you're like, okay, this is interesting. I'm glad you told me about it. But by the 5th day where they've been posting every day, you get tired of it. And so the last thing you want to do is to annoy your target audience. So I think the key here backs up to something we talked about earlier, which was building a crowd in advance of a Kickstarter. I was talking about to the artists in the room, you're putting your portfolio online so people can start to follow you and become fans of your art. And that, because of that, they've opted in to learning more about your art. And it doesn't feel like promotion then if you reach out to that community and say, hey, this art that you've been following for the last few months, now there's a way that you can act on it. So it doesn't quite feel like promotion when you do that, even though technically it is, to tell those people that you have a Kickstarter project. There are also a few other ways. Like I usually send out a few review copies to reviewers, and part of that is promotion. Part of that is showing people what the game is on other people's channels, other people's YouTube channels or podcasts or blogs. Part of that also is just giving people a third-party perspective of whether or not the game is good. Yeah, those are the key points that I had here for promotion.
And then my last big question, and this kind of goes back to this idea of kickstarting, or I know a lot of people in this room might be interested in selling their game to an established publisher. So how does marketing work between those two things, and how does it differ between kickstarting and selling to another company?
Yeah, so at my company, most of the games we published are my own games, but we do accept submissions from other designers. And what I'm looking for in a submission, and this ties to the marketing, is a fully fledged, like play-tested, designed, developed game, but not a game that already has art or graphic design, because that's my responsibility as a publisher. Art and graphic design are a huge part of the marketing of a product. They are the entire visual element of the product. And so I think this is one of the key differences between Kickstarter and just designing a game. Because if you're just designing a game, while you might have, you want to keep the visuals in mind, but you should not invest your own money into paying for them up front, because you might submit to a publisher and they might say, nope, we're not going to use this artist. And then you've invested a lot of money into art that they're never going to use. They might even change the theme of the game. Whereas on Kickstarter, you have control over all those things. You decide who the artist is. You decide what the theme is. There's no one else having a say in that. So that marketing, that overall package that you're creating is all your responsibility, which can be a lot of fun, but it's also a lot of pressure to find the right fit for the art and the graphic design. And this is one of the biggest mistakes that I see on Kickstarter. I've made it myself as well, where you don't get the right artist, or you don't get the right graphic designer. I'm sure all of you have seen well, I'm not sure, but I have seen a lot of campaign pages where I love the idea of the game, but I lose a lot of interest, and even I lose confidence in the creator when I see how poor the graphic design is. It says to me that they haven't fully thought this through. So those elements of the marketing of the overall package are so important, I think, when you have that responsibility as a Kickstarter creator.
And one more question I have. We've discussed building a community, and a few times it's been mentioned just the way that the game appears to people, or would you consider those two of the most important aspects of marketing your game, or are there other things that you would say are like the big things that should be considered when creating something like this and marketing it?
Well, I mean, those are the biggest things. It's like the whole idea of marketing is creating an experience for people. So it's not just like parts of marketing are the idea of sharing it, of building an audience, of advertising. Those are like little parts of it. But marketing is like the whole process of creating a product from start to finish, and creating something that people are engaged in. So yeah, you're right. I mean, the art and graphic design aren't everything. They're a big part of it, but it's the whole package. Like just having a grasp of the whole package. And maybe an overarching idea here is to have a clear vision for what that package is going to be, what that product is going to be, but also try to be as open to feedback as possible. By putting it out there. So something I recommend, this ties back to art, but it applies to anything. Like something I recommend to creators as they're picking the art for a game is that they actually pick several different artists and get the opinions of people who don't care about their feelings at all. So basically don't go to your friends and family and say, hey, which artist do you like the most? Or do you like the artist that I picked? Instead, go to random strangers on Facebook. Go to one of the Kickstarter or game design guilds or groups on Facebook and put it out there to people who don't care at all about you and see what they think. Because they're the people who are going to either buy your game or not buy your game, and they're going to give you honest feedback about it. So whether that's the art or some other part of the game, finding a way to get honest feedback when you're ready to actually act on that feedback is huge. And that can save you a ton of time and money if you're willing to do that up front.
Do we have any other questions for Jamey?
I was like, I have one. So the campaign that you're running, you've said that you're hoping to sell or to get enough backers to maybe do 1,500 copies. Should you be hoping to get more that way you can continue to sell after the campaign, or after the campaign is run, later you do a campaign for a second print, or how do you continue selling and making money?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because if usually the way the math works out is that if you don't have extra games to sell, you limit your ability to reprint the game. So like what I did for Viticulture, I had 942 backers, and I think they needed about 1,300 games. And from those funds that I raised on Kickstarter, I was able to afford a print run of 2,500 games.
Okay.
And so those additional 1,200 games, which I then sold to distributors after I released the Kickstarter copies, they funded the next print run. So it kind of created a cycle of printing ongoing games at that point for that one particular game. So yeah, that's if that's possible, that's a big part of the strategy. The risk there, though, is that no one buys your game after the Kickstarter project is released.
1,200.
So you might have 1,200 games that no one buys.
The next thing I was wondering, you mentioned getting reviewers, be it bloggers or YouTube people. What's the best way to approach those people? I guess it'd be engaging ahead of time and then they'd be familiar with you, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a key part of it. Engaging with them in some way in advance. So that when you do go to them, that they recognize your name at least a little bit. That's not always possible. Like you might discover a reviewer a month before your project is going to release that you really love, and you really haven't had time to build that relationship with them, but you still are interested in giving them the game. And I think the key there is to reach out to them in a personal way. So don't send a mass email to 20 different reviewers and hope that 5 respond. Instead, compose an email specifically for each reviewer, telling them what you like about their channel and why you think with the things that they've talked about, why you think they might connect with the game. So you might find a reviewer, if you're designing like a 2-player only game, you might find a reviewer that really loves 2-player only games, or at least has strong opinions about 2-player only games. And in your email to them, you'll acknowledge that and say, hey, I have a 2-player game. This is why I think you might like it. So you make that connection and you show them that it's not just some generic message. I think that makes a huge difference.
And then I have one more.
No, I love that. Keep going.
In that same vein, I've watched a lot of YouTube reviews where they're doing Kickstarter games, and half of them are really beautiful prototypes, and others are just printed out cards.
Mhm.
Do you prefer one or the other, or, and if so, for the prototypes, do you recommend how would go about getting a really nice copy, or?
Yeah. Well, if someone is submitting a game to me for publication, the more effort they put into making the prototype nice, the better. It definitely helps my impression of it. But I also understand if their resources were limited and they could only just write on index cards. I can work with that too. But yeah, if you do decide to make a more polished prototype, first I recommend using either Photoshop or InDesign to actually do the layout for it. And then there are a few different companies that you can use to prototype games. I highly recommend one called Print and Play Productions. They do excellent prototypes of board games. So I've worked with them a number of times. And the guy who runs it, a guy named Andrew, it's a very personal approach. I can email him a file and he can work with it and turn it into something nice.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah.
How do you personally go about like finding an artist, or what are the platforms that you find them on? Like when you like meet a new one.
Yeah, so I have a few different methods there. So originally when I was looking for an artist for viticulture, I looked on a place called Deviant Art and a place called, I think it's Concept Art. Deviant Art and Concept Art. Those two are two places where I found some artists that I liked. But the biggest thing that I found now that I love using as a resource are existing games. So, you guys, I don't know if you can see part of my collection behind me. So the games back there and the games that I read about online and that I see, if I see a game where I love the art in it, I just reach out to the artist and I see what their rates are or if they're available. For some reason, I always thought that that artists were completely unattainable in some way, but I found that artists just want work like everybody else. So using existing games as a way to figure out what art you want for your games is a great way to do it. Are you asking because you want to look for an artist or because you want to be in a place where people can actually find you as an artist?
Yeah, where people can actually find me. Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing you could do if you're just starting out there is that you could on a limited basis volunteered to if you find designers who are prototyping their games, you could create a piece of art for those games. Not a lot of it, but you could design a card for them. You could illustrate a card just to start to get it out there and to get your work on Board Game Geek so people can start to discover it. That might be one way to get started for you to get your first game.
Thanks. Okay.
So, I guess I was wondering, so aside, I guess after the campaign, I guess a little bit during it, you worked with Tabletopia and I guess the Tabletop Simulator.
Yeah.
I think going forward for other Kickstarters, people should start trying to use these tools to almost in addition to a print and play, would people maybe start doing a Tabletop Simulator module or whatever? I don't know what the official term is for those, I guess, but little thing they can to check out the game or whatever, or is that something you save for after the Kickstarter or something like that?
No, yeah, that's a great question. And it really, as you said, it comes back to the idea of a print and play, which when I ran the viticulture campaign, it completely surprised me of how eager people were to print out the game on their own home printer, and play it before it looked like much of anything. And I think that's evolved, as you said, into these nice platforms, Tabletopia and Tabletop Simulator, where it's essentially they're physics engines, really. Because there's a little bit, but there's no AI. The game doesn't know what the pieces are. It just knows that it's a a card or a player mat. And I think they're great resources for a campaign, so that people don't have to, so people can have that print and play experience of testing out a game without actually having to print anything. I think they're amazing platforms for that.
Yeah. I mean, but do you think people should start like should they do it like after the campaign or like as or should they do it during the campaign for advertising, or would that like kind of spoil it because people kind of get the game almost? I mean, I don't know if that's even an issue, I guess, because I guess they're getting pretty good. Like people, I guess there's also been copyright issues with Tabletop Simulator and stuff. People kind of stealing games and stuff. So I'm just kind of curious, like if you think that's an area there that would be advertising-ish or marketing-ish, or if it would be more a product after the game or after the campaign or something like that.
My personal stance is that I would love to have that throughout the project and ongoing after that. And for a while, I had the same concern that you're expressing there. I was worried that people would play it on Tabletopia or Tabletop Simulator, and then that would be the whole experience that they'd want for that game. That would be enough for them, and they wouldn't want to actually back it or pay for it. But what I found is, that hardly ever happens. Well, my perception is that it doesn't happen very often, and that more likely it has the Ticket to Ride effect, which is when Days of Wonder started putting Ticket to Ride on iOS and Android, their cardboard sales went way up because people were learning the game on a little handheld device and wanting the full tabletop experience. And so I think it really magnifies sales to have that. And the second thing is, there are going to be some people who play it on Tabletopia and realize that it's not a good game for them. And that's awesome. I think that's great that we aren't selling things to customers who don't end up wanting them. I think that's a good thing overall. I think that's maybe just a small, it'll only hurt your sales a little bit, but in the end, you'll end up with a lot more satisfied customers rather than a small percentage of customers who regret the purchase.
Yeah. I guess also, I mean, something that I like talking to friends who, they don't, I mean, I Kickstarter a little bit more stuff just because it's fun and interesting. But I feel like people have like almost this Kickstarter backlash of like, especially when existing companies or like bigger companies are like kickstarting games. And I feel like board games is kind of getting weird because like people are starting to perceive like, I mean, like even like Stegmaier games and stuff. I mean, because I don't have this opinion, but I like talk to other people. It's like this company is big enough; they don't need Kickstarter anymore. I'm just kind of curious, like what your perception is. I mean, because you're obviously, I mean, I think you seem to be doing well, but I don't really know.
And that's actually a key thing there. You don't know what a company's books look like.
Technically, I don't.
Right, but yeah, I think that's a great question. Because I've heard that all over the place. Absolutely. I think the key is how you decide to use Kickstarter is what really matters. So the way I use it is I use it for a few reasons. One, I use it to raise funds because, as you said, while my company is doing well, it doesn't mean that I necessarily have $1 million in cash to invest in a print run of a game like Scythe, which costing about $1 million just to manufacture. So that's part of it. Part of it is to gauge demand, and this is a huge part of it too. For Scythe, for example, I probably had enough cash on hand that I could have produced a print run of 1,500 copies of Scythe. It's an expensive game, and I could have done that, and hopefully it would have sold well. But because I ran the Kickstarter campaign, I knew exactly how many people were interested in buying it in advance, and we were able to make 26,000 copies of games. So it's a huge difference in that engaging that demand just because I was able to run a campaign. There's also the community building element. There's the marketing element of it. I think all those factors contribute to the reason why I want to run a Kickstarter campaign.
Yeah.
But yeah, it does. I think it does become more and more tricky as Kickstarter continues to evolve. Like for my company, I want to continue to use it for those reasons, but I only intend to use it for new products, and particularly new games, where I really need to gauge that level of demand up front to figure out how many I'm going to print in the first print run.
Right, I see. until like maybe secondary print runs or like second runs or something like that. That seems like a good, yeah.
Yeah, second print runs in particular, I don't do on Kickstarter because like as important as my relationship is to my backers and people who buy my games, it's also really important that I keep a good relationship with retailers and distributors. Because they're the ones that are going to be selling, hopefully, many tens of thousands of copies of my games.
Yeah.
The Kickstarter is usually only a few thousand copies.
Yeah.
So if I keep running Kickstarter after Kickstarter for every new print run, they're not going to buy games from me anymore.
Yeah. I think it's always been also a thing that seems to be an issue. We've been like talking to store owners and stuff because they're a little bit hesitant, because
Right.
it's already been bought. But yeah, second print runs, that's a perfect opportunity. That makes sense.
Right.
So I guess I don't want to keep talking and do that. But so I guess I'm wondering, like, have you like looked into like Patreon, or have you seen any board game people do anything with Patreon? I mean, it's probably not the same sort of thing. I mean, because it's like more of a continual funding sort of thing. But I guess like I'm just kind of curious if board games and Patreon sort of have some sort of idea that they can mess with. I don't know.
Well, yeah. So Patreon. Do you all know what Patreon is? Does anyone not know what Patreon is?
I don't know.
Okay, so Patreon is, it looks similar to Kickstarter, but instead of paying one time for a reward, you're usually paying a very small amount on an ongoing basis. So you might be paying $1 a month to support a podcast. There are lots of podcasts on Patreon. So it's like ongoing content. And usually I found that the rewards don't really matter. Like people do it, like the Patreons that I support, most of them are podcasts, and that's just my way of saying, hey, I like what you're doing. I want you to keep doing it. I want to help you pay for that nice mic eventually in small little increments. But I think, to answer your question, I think some board game companies do something similar to Patreon. They just don't use Patreon for it. Fantasy Flight Games, they often release like a new pack of cards for a game once every month or every 2 months. And it's really on a very regular basis. And I think, they're essentially running, like people subscribe to it. So it's essentially a Patreon campaign. They're just not using Patreon for it. So I've thought about doing that, but it's, my company is very small. It's just me and kind of 2 part-time guys. So creating that much ongoing content isn't possible for me to do.
That would be tricky, yeah. That'd be interesting, actually. Huh.
Any other questions? Is there any other wisdom you would like to impart on us before we go, Jamey?
Well, I guess I'll turn that back around to you guys real quick, because I have plenty of things that you can read about in my blog and my book. But as you think about the idea of Kickstarter, as you've backed Kickstarter campaigns or other crowdfunding campaigns, is there anything, any big concerns or fears that you have about it that I can maybe help address? Anything that's come to mind? Anything maybe that you've experienced with a project that you've backed, or something you've read about in the news? Anything like that you have questions about?
Yeah.
And you may not. But.
Yeah, I guess I think the thing I've always been surprised by is people getting in over their head. Partially it's like stretch goals.
Right.
That seems, you've talked about that a little bit. But yeah, I'm just kind of surprised how many projects I've backed. And I guess usually I do like lower end things, like, so unless it's like a super established company or somebody I just really like I don't know, I just got Millennium Blades. I'm super hyped about that. But all that, they did good stuff. So, but even that, they had like too much stretch goals. They had to like split their expansion into like 2 different things, and that was kind of a weird mess or whatever. Kind of surprised how that happens, but so like do you feel like hype essentially does like how do you like mitigate hype for games and stuff? Or I guess Scythe, you had a clear plan, it seemed, for how you're doing everything.
Yeah, a lot of the reason that Scythe has gone pretty well so far in terms of production is my willingness to say no at the right times. At certain times, I wanted to say yes to more stuff or cooler stuff, but I knew my budget and I knew to say no. And sometimes that was coming from backers too, wanting more stuff. And I've experienced that too as a backer. I always want more and better stuff. But more than that, I want a creator to be able to say no at the right time, so that they don't ruin the budget or ruin the schedule. And we've seen, I would say probably the most notable thing, I don't know if you all have heard about this, but there was a mega project on Kickstarter 2 summers ago called The Coolest Cooler. You hear about this one? It raised like, I think $13 million on Kickstarter. At the time, it was the biggest Kickstarter ever. And it's basically like a cooler, the type of cooler that you take to the pool or the beach, that had like a speaker system in it, it had a blender in it, and had all sorts of stuff attached to the inside. And people paid like $200, $300 for it. So they raised a ton of money and seemed to have a great plan for actually manufacturing this thing. But then they ran into one trouble after another, and they still, I think they're 6 months late, maybe even a year late at this point. No, they're 6 months late because they were supposed to deliver it this past summer. And it's not only ruined their campaign, but it's ruined their entire brand.
Yeah.
That one bad experience has changed the shape of that company forever. So that's it's so important to budget well for that first project, and even start small with a small, simple project that's really hard to screw up, so that you can establish your brand from the beginning.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I have a question, I guess, with the stretch goals. So you said to do your minimum funding level, you took the manufacturing price plus shipping and handling, and so but then you get all the stretch goals. Do you have most of them prepared ahead of time? So like, how do you budget for adding more stretch goals? Because that would eventually increase your costs for each. Like, would you add a couple extra bucks at each pledge level to plan for some more expensive stretch goals, or?
Yeah, so kind of a couple of different things there. One, yeah, I do try to build in some wiggle room into everything, into the budget, into every reward level, just in case there is something that I want to add that it doesn't ruin everything. But for the most part, yeah, I try to budget very precisely in advance as to what all the stretch goal levels are and how they're going to be staggered throughout the project. That's all planned in advance. And usually I try to unveil it during the project in what appears to be an organic and even on the spot way, but really it's all planned in advance. It's completely staged.
Right.
Now there are a few instances where I'll realize that I have extra room on a card sheet, or I have a little bit of wiggle room with a certain component, and I'll add it or I'll change it on the spot during the campaign. But that's pretty rare at this point.
And now the next thing would be if something came up big, like for example your metal coins.
Mm-hmm.
How do you feel about doing things as like add-ons? Do you think that enhances the game, or does that mess up shipping, or what is it? Well, yeah,
you're wise to mention shipping there, because it can change the shape or the weight, and that can change your shipping costs. But so I've done that a few times. The most notable time was on Euphoria. So Euphoria was a $49 game on Kickstarter, and it had these dice that I mentioned before. It had these nice dice, and in the first week of the campaign, I found a lot of backers were asking to buy an extra set of the dice, and which I wasn't prepared for. I didn't think that would happen at all. I didn't anticipate people asking to buy extra dice. And so after talking to my manufacturer, I decided instead of doing an add-on, which I could have done and that would have been fine, I created another reward level at $59 that was the same game, but with an extra set of dice, and there was another component they wanted to, some extra cards in the box. So it was all packaged together in the same box, which made it easier to ship, because instead of the shipping company, usually shipping companies charge per thing that they're putting in the box. So if I had put the dice separate from the game, they would have had to pack 2 things in the box. And not only would that be an extra charge to put that extra thing in the box, but it would also it would increase the possibility of human error where they don't put that in the box. So I basically created a new reward level based on what people were saying, and created a new version of the game just for that add-on. I do that sparingly though, because I try, like with Scythe, I have 5 different SKUs. I have 5 different versions of the game. And that's more than I would ideally have. ideally I would have 2 or 3 versions of the game.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah.
All right. I think we're out of questions.
Yeah, well, thank you all. And if you do end up having extra questions after this, Jeremy has my contact information, and you can always post on my Kickstarter blog with any question that you have, and I try to answer every question there. I'm happy to help.
Well, thank you again, Jamey, for joining us.
Thank you. All right, thanks.
And I guess we're done. Thank you.
All right. Take care, guys. Have a good night.